If you know me already, then you'll know I'm an absolute geek when it comes to data, especially when measuring well-being in the workplace. Put me in front of SPSS with a full set of well-being survey results, and I will happily spend hours running analyses, pulling out trends, and creating 4-box models. Now, this is partly because I like numbers, and I get a little bit of a thrill from finding a significance level less than 0.05. Sorry, that's a pretty niche joke. But I'm also a firm believer that data can play a really crucial and essential role in any organisational wellbeing strategy. You can use it for all sorts of things like benchmarking your business, tracking progress over time, proving ROI, setting board level KPIs, prioritising and targeting your wellbeing interventions, all sorts of things. After all, the old saying tells us, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But all this being said, we still have some pretty major problems when it comes to wellbeing measurement, not least our reliance on self-report data as the main source of insight. And the fact that when collected this way, rather than it being if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, we often find ourselves saying the important stuff can't be measured. But is that right? Or are we just measuring it in the wrong way? So in this video, I'm going to look at some alternatives to self-report wellbeing assessments, starting with some solid existing options that are already out there, and then exploring some more wacky alternative ideas, and even taking a look into what the future might hold when it comes to wellbeing measurement. Right, quick disclaimer before we start. I don't actually mind self-report surveys. If designed well and used consistently, I feel like they can give you some really useful insight. In fact, if you've done all the legwork to design your assessment properly, you've carried out validity studies, you've explored alternative data collection methods like 360-degree ratings, then it's likely that you've got some really useful data. And in several circumstances, surely some data is better than none at all. But all of this doesn't change the fact that self-report is nowhere near perfect. So let's just take a look at a few questions from some popular wellbeing measures that are out there. The ONS in the UK collect wellbeing data using 4 questions, which can then be used to feed into public policy decisions. I really like this measure because it's succinct, it's short, and it measures both hedonic and eudaimonic wellbeing. But let's look at a question from that survey. They ask, overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? Could you answer that? I sometimes don't remember what happened yesterday. Could I summarise my overall happiness during that day into one number? I'm not so sure. Then there's the WHO5, a scale developed by the World Health Organization to measure levels of well-being across the globe. Again, it's a short measure, which I like, but here's one of the questions they ask. I have felt active and vigorous. Your response options for this range from all of the time through to at no time. Again, I'm not sure how I'd answer this. Have I felt vigorous? I'm not too sure what that means, and also whether I'd feel comfortable sharing that on camera. Last up, let's look at a measure from the academic literature. The Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, or WEMBS for short, I think. They ask how much you agree with this statement. I've been able to make up my own mind about things. I'm not even sure I can make up my mind how to answer that question, so what does that mean? Okay, so I'm playing devil's advocate a bit here. I'm sure I could have a go at answering all 3 of these questions, and over a population, over time, the specific understanding behind each individual question might not matter that much. But is there a better way? How else can we measure workplace wellbeing? Really what we're looking for is a more objective measure, something I'm less likely to answer incorrectly. So let's start with more straightforward ideas before we go into some more creative alternatives. First up, behavioural measures may be a good way to go. For example, a researcher might measure how often an individual engages in physical activity. We could go even further with this and measure actual physical activity using a step counter or an accelerometer device. We can also capture real-life biomarkers such as height and weight. I know there's a whole industry around these kiosks and pods that you might have seen popping up around workplaces around the country where employees can measure these sorts of things. The upside to these, they are definitely objective, not subjective. The downside, it is so much easier to measure physical activity and physical state than it is to measure psychological activity. These instruments can't tell us what people are thinking and how they feel. So how do we delve a little bit deeper? Well, next up, we have heart rate variability. So HRV is simply a measure of the variation in time between each heartbeat. This variation is controlled by our autonomic nervous system, which in itself is subdivided into two components, the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, also known as the fight and flight mechanism or the relaxation response, or as I like to call them, the accelerator pedal and the brake pedal. The key point here is that HRV can provide us with a proxy for how stressed someone is. Put simply, are they getting too much accelerator pedal and not enough of the brake? There are some pretty cool devices out there to measure this stuff. Some of the new smartwatches capture HRV in some detail, but there are also professional grade devices such as First Beat Life, which I've used previously, that you can actually stick to yourself and they pick up HRV in a much more granular way. Okay, so this sounds good, an objective measure that gives us more insight in terms of how someone is feeling at work. But what's the downside? And there's always a downside, right? Well, I think one problem is just how invasive some of these tools might seem. First Beat, for example, you've actually got to stick the pads to your chest and wear them for a few days. And even if it's something like a watch, are you happy to share all of this data with your employer inside and outside of work? So one measure that I've not mentioned is a little bit different and definitely not invasive, and that's to explore what data you already have in the business, and again use that as a proxy towards understanding the state of things. So here I'm thinking about things like sickness absence levels, retention figures, performance measures, customer feedback, all this sort of thing. Great, we don't have to ask individual employees to do anything different to measure these factors, and we can pick up some really useful trends over time. The problem is that these measures aren't always reliable. So do people always report when they're sick? And what about presenteeism and leaveism? And they can feel like a little bit of a blunt instrument to measure something as nuanced as emotions or mental health. They might just be too far removed. Right, let's get into the fun stuff. What new ways do we have to measure well-being, and what might the future hold? Let's start with AI. Large language models, or LLMs, can help us in a number of different ways. The biggest thing I think it can help with is qualitative data analysis and make this viable across large organizations and populations. Before AI, who on earth had the patience to wade through thousands of comments from an employee survey and pull out themes? And even if you did, could you do that every week, or would that more likely be limited to something like an annual survey? So as LLMs are getting better, we may also be able to use them to conduct things like semantic analysis. What if AI could work in the background to read every email, chat, or text message sent between your employees and tell you if they're getting more positive or negative over time? Plus, they could pull out useful themes and things that you need to know to understand the psychological state of the workforce. It feels pretty Big Brother-ish, but I honestly think people might get used to it. There are some companies already trialling these sorts of things, and you should check out the work of a guy I've worked with called Fionn Delahunty at Lua Health on this. He's done some really interesting work and research around measuring mental health using AI. Another tech product that I got particularly obsessed with a few years ago is eye tracking. Currently mostly used in the advertising industry to decide how to make catchy adverts and trailers for movies. I have seen studies popping up that say that we can use eye tracking to help understand mental health issues better. For example, there's a really cool study by a group of researchers in India that claim to be able to measure real-time stress states when watching a video. Now imagine we could apply this to the workplace and that feeling you get when you receive an unexpected email from your manager or a client, and you might have something really interesting there. So then last but very much not least is my personal favourite. Could poo be the future of workplace wellbeing measurement? Okay, let me give a little bit more context. Some clever bods out there have realised that you can track all sorts of things within the human body using what's called wastewater surveillance, basically testing the water that come out of people's loos. During the pandemic, for example, there was work done in the US to track the spread of the COVID disease using this sort of method. But the thing I'm really excited about is it can also pick up markers of stress and well-being. That's right. You can tap into the waste pipe of an area and measure it for stress hormones like cortisol and cortisone. I'm going to drop a link in the comments below for a study which absolutely blew my mind. There's a group of researchers in Arizona State University who tapped into the wastewater system of a university campus and took daily composite samples to test. What they were able to show were reproducible weekly patterns of stress. Stress was highest on a Monday and lowest on a Sunday. They also found out that the first 2 months of the semester tended to be most stressful for people, and around exam times those stress levels went up. Now this all sounds obvious, but the fact that they can pick this up objectively from wastewater, I think is absolutely fascinating. What if we applied this to a large corporate HQ? Could we track stress levels over time and use this information to guide our interventions? Who knows? Look, I'm not suddenly expecting every big company around the globe to start measuring their employees' waste. It's not the perfect measure, and I'm sure more data is needed, but the fact that this provides a potential objective, reliable, and non-invasive way of tracking stress in real time is crazy to me. And that's the goal, right? If we are agreed that self-report measures of well-being may start to become a thing of the past, we have to look to the future and creative ways to track these sorts of things. So what do you think? How would you feel about your company tracking your well-being through your heart rate, eye motions, or when you go to the toilet? And have I missed anything? Is your company using any innovative ways to track well-being and stress? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.